Our first speaker is going to be Bob Klamser. Bob has over 25 years of law enforcement experience, mostly in Southern California, evidently. Co-founder of Crisis Consulting International in 1985. CCI, which is Crisis Consulting International's abbreviation, provides security and crisis management services to evangelical missionaries and humanitarian communities. They've conducted over 107 hostage negotiations outside the U.S., mostly with terrorist groups. Also served as part of the study group that recommended widespread changes in the U.S. hostage policy to the president. Last year, has served as pastoral staff of Ventura Missionary Church for over 13 years. Basically, what Bob's people do is when your mission groups make unwise choices, and that results in some kind of security situation, that's who you call. That's who I know him as. I think one of the last couple of conventions that we've had, he was scheduled to speak, but he couldn't do it because he's right in the middle of some hostage negotiation in Africa or something like that. So, he does it for a living, real stuff. So, Bob, where are you? Come back up here. Please help me welcome Bob Klamser. All right, you got it? Okay.
We're good. Thanks, Chuck. Sounds like I'm on, so let's see if look at that, it works. It's going to be a good morning. So, yeah, it's really a privilege to be here. I do tend to be out of the country a lot, but we're here this time, and just want to share with you a little bit. You have a handout. Now, George Carey in the back is part of my organization as well, and George knows full well that I cannot not dicker with my presentations up to the last minute. So actually some new material came out this week, an ISIS publication and some stuff that got lifted from the U.S. government. So the PowerPoint's going to be a little bit different towards the end. We've made arrangements. We're going to email everybody an updated PDF to replace the one you have. Most of it will be the same. So you heard a little bit about us. CCI is we call ourselves a ministry. We're all volunteers. Like many of you, we found that there is a place for what we've learned in law enforcement or military or places like that in missions, which is pretty cool. So our vision, we do training, risk assessment, we do site surveys and things, but we do a lot of crisis response. Many of that are hostage negotiations, like Chuck said. All right, so I'm going to go quick because I want to get through everything, and I tend to overpack my presentations. But we're going to talk about the terrorism threat today. Why? Because it's different. You need to know who they are. You need to know what they think about you, why they do it, what they're planning. It is not the 1970s of terrorism. It's a religious-based threat, and that has profound implications for us in the faith-based community. But let's start by defining what terrorism is. Out in California, where we do weird things, a law was passed last year that said if one side of a domestic partnership telephones the other side and says certain things, it's terrorism. No, it's not. Terrorism is something different. Benjamin Netanyahu came up with what I think is the best definition. Terrorism is the deliberate and intentional use of violence against an innocent population to inspire fear to cause change. The key, it's violence against innocent people to scare the rest of us to make a change. Brian Jenkins is probably the most experienced researcher. He's been studying terrorism for over 40 years with the RAND Corporation, and he makes the point that the victim may be totally unrelated to the terrorist cause. Terrorism is violence aimed at the people watching. Terrorism is me attacking you guys to make them so afraid they change their behavior. You guys may be symbolic targets, or you may just be available. And we're seeing both kinds of terrorist attacks. But the key isn't what I do to you. The key is what they do out of fear. And that's what makes terrorism so different. And it makes, if we're responsible for the safety of people, whether it's missionaries, short-term teams, whether it's the church, if you're responsible for the safety of people, you have to understand your adversary, right? I mean, this is pretty basic stuff. And there's a lot of misunderstanding of the current adversary. I'm not going to get political, but I mean, we have politicians that are fighting over names and labels, and the names and labels aren't the enemy. The adversary is the enemy. We're going to talk about it. But it's not effective, ethical, moral, or legal, but terrorism is around because it works. It works. Osama bin Laden's goal for the 9/11 attacks, ultimately his goal, the endgame goal, he wanted to create such fear on the part of the United States and its citizens and other Western countries, but mostly the U.S., that we would lash out against all Muslims around the world, because he thought that would draw or drive Muslims who were not involved in jihad into jihad. It would unify Islam against the West and against Christianity. That was the goal. I don't think he succeeded completely, but as far as causing change, using fear to cause change, think of this. If you had been to a presentation of any kind, maybe at a university or just a speaker or something, on September 10th of 2001, day before, and the speaker had said to you, ladies and gentlemen, within 2 years, the United States of America will go anywhere in the world it wants and will snatch any person it wants off the street and take that person to any place it wants and hold them as long as it wants and may or may not charge them with a crime and may or may not give them consular access, what would we have said? We said, you're crazy. We've got all kinds of laws and values and things, and the point isn't whether or not those things are right or wrong or effective or ineffective. The nation was scared enough that we changed. And actually those steps were Al-Qaeda and now ISIS and the other groups use that activity as an inspirational tool against us. This is why it's so important we understand how these groups are and what they think of us. The goals of terrorism are always the same: tear down what is and replace it with what they want. And of course, it's much easier to tear down. That's the easy part. Very few groups know how to put a government in place, whatever kind of government they want, and make it work. There's, you know what? Question. You can interrupt me for questions. Depending on how the time goes, I might say let's wait till the end. I have a second presentation this afternoon. We might even spill over with that. But I'm going fast, but that doesn't mean I don't want you to ask questions. So please feel free to do that. But there's this progression of terrorism that's important to understand the progression because we're right in the midst of it now, and it affects targeting. And that's our job. Are we targets? What's the chance that we're targets? What do we do to detect that? And then what do we do to mitigate the risk? Terrorists compete for 3 resources. And they need these 3. A terrorist group needs all 3 resources. They need money, they need recruits, and they need time on media. And without an adequate supply or resource of those 3, the group is not going to be able to launch itself onto the world stage. Back in the 1970s, a group could do one act and just be all over the news for a week. There's way too much competition now, and these groups are literally competing against each other for those 3 resources. That means they have to be successful. So when a group starts out, is just beginning, they're going to look for targets that get them a lot of media value, but they've got to be successful. Terrorism is about fear. If you do or try an attack and you fail, nobody fears you, and your sponsors, your donors, and your recruits are all going somewhere else. So they pick targets, soft targets. You guys know what the term means. Easiest way to say it is people who can't shoot back. But you can only do that for so long and keep getting media attention when you've got other groups that are attacking governments or the infrastructure. So the group's going to progress, symbolic targets, up into the government itself or infrastructure, and sooner or later, one of 3 things happen. The terrorist group wins and takes over. Anybody want to shout out an example, a modern example of that? Libya? Afghanistan with the Taliban? Iraq? Yeah, so there are examples of that. They are few and far between. The second thing that happens is the government and the group reach some kind of an accommodation, which typically looks like this. Terrorist group lays down their guns and says, we'll stop being bad boys, we'll stop being terrorists. Government says, great, everybody gets amnesty. And the terrorist group becomes a political party normally. Probably the best example of that is the M19 in Colombia. That happens as well, but by far the most common end of the progression or transfer point in the progression is that the government suppresses the terrorist group to a significant degree. And what happens, well, here's a good example of that. In Peru, Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, the people just got fed up in the 80s and into the 90s with Sendero Luminoso. They elected a president on a mandate and a platform to take care of the threat. And he came in and he pretty much did that. He didn't eliminate Sendero Luminoso, but he really chopped it down. The problem was, to do that, you almost have to have a scorched earth kind of policy, and he did. And the things that got scorched were civil liberties and the Constitution. And that president, President Fujimori, is now serving time in a Peruvian jail for doing the job he was elected to do. It's a tough thing. But when the progression reverses, when a government has success against a terrorist group, we see the group, unless you completely eliminate it, it starts back at the lower cycle. Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda organization that existed on 9/11 of 2001, doesn't exist anymore. The U.S. and its allies in the coalition were very effective in essentially decapitating that regime and suppressing it, and now it's not this great big organization that can mount the kind of attack we saw on 9/11. It's hundreds of small cells all around the world, and 2 or 3 major branches as well. And actually, it's a much harder target now. If you have one organization that you can target and build intelligence on, that's one thing. But if you've got hundreds of little cells, that's another. But when that happens, the group goes back to non-combatant targets. They go back to soft targets with symbolic value. The next Al-Qaeda attack after 9/11, anybody happen to know what it is? It was against Murray Christian School, an MK school, a missionary kids school in Pakistan. And then after that, it was against the Protestant International Church in Pakistan, symbolic targets that couldn't shoot back, or at least Al-Qaeda didn't think they could, but got them back, said, we're still around, we can still operate. So when the government's got this suppression going on, and when the group has suppressed it, actually can be more dangerous for those of us who don't have all the hard security options that some other sectors do. We're seeing this right now in testimony by the director of the CIA in front of Congress. I'm going to show you that with a little bit of a later slide, but he's basically said ISIS is much more dangerous now because there have been some battlefield successes in the Syria-Iraq caliphate. Okay. Am I going too fast for you guys? Okay, fast forward. Here we go. So the tools of terrorism always come down to these 4: bombs, assassinations, assaults and assassinations, facility takeover, active shooters, and then the least frequent hostage taking. Bombing, the most common, year in, year out, about 50% of all terrorist events. And the reason for that is it's easy. It's easy. If you can read the internet and bake a cake based on the internet, you can build a bomb. And of course, you get lots of impact with bombs, and you can be, if you're any good at all, you can be 100 miles away when the thing goes off. It's amazing how many bomb makers blow themselves up, because it's just not that difficult to do. But you get a lot of, if you'll excuse me, bang for the buck, and you don't have to have the risk of some of these others. As you go through assaults and assassinations, active shooter things, or hostage taking, the adversary has to be exposed longer. Essentially, active shooters are suicide missions. Hostage cases aren't. And the hostage ones, you get a lot of publicity, but it's a lot of expenditure for the organization as well. But the weapon of terrorism is fear. The other things are just tools. This is in the Westgate Mall in Nairobi. That was an incident that, if you remember, the Westgate Mall, I don't know if anybody's been to Nairobi, but this is was a very upscale mall. This is, in every sense of the word, a first world mall owned by Israeli investors. A lot of security. I'd been there several times, eaten at the restaurant, been at the coffee shop, and the siege of the Westgate Mall took about 3.5 days. Actually, the New York Police Department deploys intelligence officers around the world. It drives the State Department crazy, but they do, and that's because New York has been a target, and they just insist that they need to do that. 2 New York City intelligence officers did what's probably the best investigation, and you can actually read the investigation online, and it said there were 3 terrorists, and they were there about 12 hours. So after 12 hours they're gone for almost 3 days. The Kenyan government's trying to sort it out and basically are blowing up the mall. At the same time, things are being looted and stolen. The fear factor is tremendous. And you know, our side gets this as well. Rats. They're supposed to come up one at a time. You see who the guy is in the orange jumpsuit? Richard Ramirez, the shoe bomber. This is not the scariest looking guy in the world. In fact, he looks pretty goofy, right? And that's why this is the photo that the U.S. government will always use for Richard Ramirez, because this one's a little scarier. But they're the same guy. Whoops. Same with this gentleman. Anybody know who he is? KSM. He was the guy that did the operational planning of the 9/11 attacks. And although there's nothing that can make him look pretty, this was taken right after he was arrested in Thailand in the middle of the night, bad hair night and all that going on. It's still a better picture than these two as far as fear. So what is this threat we're looking at now, and why is it different? When I started doing this in the early 80s, the terrorist groups we dealt with were primarily politically or economic system motivated. So Marxist, Maoist, capitalist versus communist, homeland territorial issues in there, but they were political causes. And an interesting thing, as bad as they were, there was no case ever of a suicide bomber representing a Marxist Maoist group. They'll get in a fight, they'll do hard fights against the odds, but they're not going to do a suicide mission because politics and economic systems aren't worth it. You have to get to religion before you have the motivation for someone to be a suicide bomber. So religiously motivated terrorists portray their cause, and actually, this is what they say. This is their message. This is the message of Osama bin Laden and all of the other charismatic terrorist leaders in the world. God exists. God wants you to do this thing. God's going to reward you if you do it, and He's going to punish you if you don't. If you can convince your audience of that message, you've got them. They'll do anything because God said do it, and He's going to reward you and punish you if you don't. And that is the message that Osama bin Laden and the others, his peers and his generation, talk about. Now, I need to be very careful here. I don't need to say something, we all need to hear it. I don't know if Islam is a religion of peace or a religion of violence. I've studied it. I can't figure it out. I'm not smart enough. I know very, very bright people who've studied it and written what they think, and they come down 50-50. Okay, so I don't know the answer to that question. Here's something I do know. Christianity is a religion based on love. God's love for us and His desire for us to love each other. And you guys know the tenets of the faith. But I know that I can go to the Bible, and in the Old Testament and the New Testament, I can pull out Scripture out of context and string it together and present you with a wonderful theology of violence without ever mentioning love, and every word will have been out of the Bible. And I know that terrorist leaders, the ones who build successful organizations like bin Laden, know how to do that, and they know how to be charismatic in their speaking. But it's not just Muslim clerics who know how to do that. This audience, there should be someone who knows the answer to this question. What is the longest continually operating terrorist group in the world? Anyone want to take a shot? Not the IRA? Nope. Nope. A group, here's a hint, it's ours. It's the Ku Klux Klan. Okay? And leaders of the Klan, David Koresh at Waco, Jim Jones at Guyana, these all project the same message that an Osama bin Laden projects. They're charismatic, they're not drooling at the mouth kinds of speakers, and they are able to persuade their audiences of those four things. And once you do that, you've got them, they'll do anything. That's why we get deeper core values, commitment, violence, expanded target pool, and they're bright people. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is the most, well, think about this. The attacks in Paris, the last major attack, multiple sites, multiple people, it was an article of faith in the intelligence and law enforcement communities that you couldn't communicate electronically in Western Europe, in the EU countries, about a terrorist act, a terrorist plot, without the intelligence services being able to intercept you. And if you remember, in the first 12 to about 24 hours after the Paris attacks, people were speculating, well, this had to be a local self-radicalized group because no one had heard them electronically. And it turns out they were just sharper than we were, and were using new technology, social media and other things, and they did, in fact, defeat or bypass our protection with electronics. And then in San Bernardino, the San Bernardino attack with the husband and wife couple, they as well communicated electronically in a widespread area, and our intelligence services didn't catch those. These guys are very, very bright. And then the concept of self-radicalization. This is the truly scary, I think, part of the new terrorism threat, and it's the one that will affect those of us responsible for churches in the U.S., any kind of a faith-based gathering in the U.S., this will be our primary adversary, the self-radicalized person, because they're so hard to track. But people, if they just keep their mouths shut before the attack and they don't go out and try to buy a whole bunch of stuff at one place at one time, they're very, very hard to detect. This is kind of a profile. It's an in-progress profile of these new jihadists, but this is what research says, and you can read it. I think the interesting thing is they've had experiences in the West. Most of these jihadists have either lived or come from the United States or a Western European nation, and it's not like bin Laden, who was showing movies about the West and trying to educate people who had no concept of what the first world looked like. These people have lived with us, and they reject it. And there's not a real deep understanding of that. Interestingly, most of them are not particularly religious prior to joining one of these groups. And the causes, if you peel this back a little bit and ask, why do you join? Most of the answers are exactly the same answers as why kids join gangs here in the U.S. It's to find a place to belong, it's to find a place with meaning, and it's to find a place where you're accepted. The camaraderie and that in these terrorist groups is incredibly tight, and it's very much like a gang. Yes, sir.
So it seems there's an emerging female population that's investing in self-esteem activities because their profile
And I don't know if I'm going to repeat the question to make sure everybody hears it. You correctly observe that there's an emerging population of female jihadis. I guess we'll use the same term. And is their profile, is it the same? No. And there's not enough of them yet that we have a good profile. And I think there are profiles of female terrorists from the Marxist-Maoist ages, and I think it'd be pretty dangerous to try and transfer those. And again, this profile is more of a leader profile. This is probably not the person who straps on the vest and walks into the crowd. This is the person who plans it, inspires it, and sends them out, picks the target, things like that. What we do know about female terrorists, jihadis, they tend to be more successful in some of their operations than men because they are more committed. Women fight to win. I'm being very cautious because my wife is in the back row, and I'm going to be very cautious here. Women fight to win. Men fight for style points and according to the rules a lot of the time. Am I right? Okay. But we don't have a good profile on what the personality of a female jihadi looks like. It's new to them and it's new to us. All right. So we have this phenomena today in 2016, but it dates back. It's not brand new, and a little history will help. After the 9/11 attacks, Foreign Policy magazine learned or heard some rumors about some notebooks. Everybody here has a 3-ring binder and a notebook. Notebooks from individuals who had attended terrorist training camps in the mid-90s, probably in Uzbekistan, and completely predating Osama bin Laden's influence in that part of the world. And it's interesting to see what they were taught. Foreign Policy concluded this was the profile of the students. They were devout, but they weren't very knowledgeable about their faith. Think about that. That's playing right into your hand if you're this charismatic leader using religion. They're devout, which means all you have to do is sell the "there's a God and he wants you to" part. And if they're not informed about their faith, they don't know when you're moving away from what the faith really says. And this was the profile of that group. Not well educated, but highly motivated. This is a quote, this is what one of the students wrote down in his book, being taught how to be a terrorist, a jihadi terrorist against the West. From among religious peoples will kill those who try to gain converts to Christianity on Muslim soil, spies who work as Christian clerics, those Christians and Jews who speak against the mujahideen, those who propagate against Islam, those Christians who collect money for the struggle against Muslims, and those who speak against Muslims. That's you guys. That's all of us. Maybe not in exactly the context here, but they were very clear about who the adversary is. And this is back in the mid-90s, as opposed to some of the struggling we see in the West now to identify who the adversary is. This was the analysis of Foreign Policy. The missionaries targeted fairly recent arrivals in Central Asia. Many belonged to U.S. evangelical groups that saw the fall of communism as a signal to expand proselytizing efforts throughout the Soviet Union. You guys remember those days? Remember the convocations? I mean, all of a sudden the wall was down and we poured through. And this was, in part, a reaction to that. So then we get Mr. bin Laden. Not the founder of Al-Qaeda, but he kind of co-opted it away from the leader, who's now got it back again, Dr. Zawahiri. But some of his statements, he's clear, and I'm not going to read each one, I'm just going to go through them as I talk. He's clear that this is a religious duty. It's all about religion. He makes no distinction about anything else. And part of that is because, as you know, Islam is a religion that encompasses all of one's life and all of society. Government and church are the same thing in Islam. And of course, we have a different view on that, but you're either with the crusade or with Islam. In 24 public statements that bin Laden made between 1994 and 2004, this is how he identifies the adversary. Christians, 6 times, Jews and Christians, or Judeo-Christians 14 times, and he uses the term crusader, 87 times. Crusader is the most common word that bin Laden used to describe his adversary. And speaking to us, when we hear the term crusader, some of us will remember there was something called the Crusades. Some of us know a little bit about it academically, but the average American, even the average American in a pew, doesn't know that much about the Crusades. But to Muslims, it's much more current, and it's much more real, and it's much more painful. And by evoking those images, bin Laden stokes the flame. It's interesting, in the first major address President Bush made after 9/11, the major one, on the 16th, he used the term, this crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to go on for a long time. A term like that doesn't get into a presidential speech by accident. I mean, those words are all carefully chosen. And numbers of people have wondered and asked and tried to find out why that word was used. Because it is certainly inflammatory to the adversary. I mean, you say we're going back on crusade, and that can be manipulated quite a bit by the other side. And there's really no good explanation for it. The president and the speechwriters haven't talked about it. The best speculation is people thought, well, this is a religious war, so we'll put it in religious terms, but probably not terribly helpful. So what changed after 9/11 besides us, the United States, going around snatching people all over the world? Prior to 9/11, I won't do that to you. Prior to 9/11, article of faith in American law enforcement that the best way to handle terrorism is to arrest the terrorists who do something and prosecute them in U.S. courts like a common criminal. Probably the emphasis on common. Because if you do that, you take away the political platform, you take away the political causes. You don't elevate this person beyond a common criminal. And that was how terrorism was handled. The 9/11 attacks changed that. And as you know, our primary tool against terrorists now is the military. And law enforcement's mandate, especially federal law enforcement, has changed from one of primarily prosecution to prevention, which is it's a whole different, you're building an intelligence capacity and options, figure out how to disrupt these things. It's a very different mission, especially for the FBI, and fundamentally change our system of justice, as we mentioned. It's now, the U.S. government basically has asserted, because of what terrorism is and the threat it poses, we'll do whatever we want, period. And that's a really, really big change. Outside the U.S., far more military actions around the world. Some of them multilateral, the coalition of the willing, or a smaller group of nations. Some of them bilateral, the U.S. and Israel, the U.S. and Germany, the U.S. and Australia. But the interesting thing is, or perhaps the biggest change, a lot more unilateral options. The U.S. government just going in and doing what it thinks it should without the permission of the host government. As a hostage negotiator, I see how other governments handle hostage cases involving their citizens. And when I was in the 1990s, Colombia was the hotbed of kidnapping. And I was down there a lot. And it was interesting because when a German citizen was kidnapped or an Israeli citizen was kidnapped, there wasn't a lot of negotiation, there wasn't a lot of politics. Military options were planned, and the way, especially the German government did it, they, at the very last minute, they're getting ready to launch, they would call a single trusted member of the Colombian, either law enforcement or military, and say, we're going on an operation. If you want to come, it'll be a joint operation. If you don't want to come, that's fine too. And they did that for security reasons. Most of the time, a Colombian went, and it was a joint operation. Israel was less inclined to even ask the question. But the U.S., absolutely not. In doing hostage negotiations and trying to explore the option of rescues with the U.S. government over 30 years, without the permission of the host government, it was never on the table. Now, it's very much on the table. Look at the operation to either seize or kill bin Laden. Pakistan, we count them as an ally because we have to. With friends like that, we don't need any more enemies. But that's the situation there. And we invaded Pakistan, mounted a military operation to either snatch him or kill him, and didn't tell them. And knowing that there would be a lot of political fallout from that. And it's just part of the change. Our intelligence capacities substantially increased. Working with other nations and sharing intelligence is much, much better than it was. But within the United States and within the different agencies, that's all better than it was. But one of the things that's happened as well is this mindset or this attitude of you're either with us or against us. President Bush said that quite clearly in the September 16th, 2001 address. And again, the issue isn't whether right or wrong, good or bad. This is what happened, and there are outcomes or reactions to that. And you're either with us or against us is exactly the same message that the terrorists are using. That's what they want. They want people divided into two camps. And they want our camp to be more aggressive in attacking their camp, because that'll draw their camp together. That's the goal, the ultimate plan of all of these groups. So, how governments respond? Remember the progression of terrorism? As the US and the West was successful against Al-Qaeda, there has not been another spectacular terrorist attack, large-scale terrorist attack in the US, and no other major, on the scale of 9/11, Al-Qaeda attacks anywhere in the world. But we have Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen. We have Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the Sahel region of Africa. Two very strong organizations, getting stronger all the time. And now we have ISIS. ISIS, does anybody know what ISIS's former name was? Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's the group that became ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Increasing interaction between governments regarding prisoner trades and ransom payments. That's pretty timely given the news that's floating around now. Did we send, what was it, 400 million? 400 million to Iran in an unmarked jet because we owed it to them or because it was a ransom. If it walks like a duck. Anyway, and a whole new U.S. policy about kidnapping cases. We'll talk about that this afternoon. The thing to remember is it's changed government response a lot. So, we have basically a small set of major terrorist groups in the world. We have two Al-Qaeda cells, I just mentioned them, they're bigger than cells. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We have the Taliban. We have Boko Haram in Nigeria. And of all the terrorist groups in the world, Boko Haram in Nigeria has killed more people than any other. But they tend to stay within Nigeria, and so they don't get as much publicity. And we've got the Taliban and ISIS. There are other groups around. You hear about Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines and these other groups, but they're much smaller. We've got these 6 major groups. And it's good that we explore what they think about us. The Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan has been the most vocal in stating and making its case against Christians and against Christians who seek to spread the gospel around the world. Gail Williams was a single female British missionary working in Afghanistan. Sid Meisel was an American female missionary who was kidnapped by the Taliban. They got her computer, they tortured her, and the best evidence, the best information we have is that a lot of Sid Meisel's contacts and names became available to the Taliban. Gail Williams' name was one of those. And there was no kidnapping, no attempt to do anything other than just assassinate her so the Taliban can make this statement. And their guy, Zaibullah Mujahideen, calls the AP, claims the death, and says the Taliban killed her because she came to Afghanistan to teach Christianity to the people of Afghanistan. It's as clear as it can be. The Taliban has a campaign against guest houses in Kabul, especially, but in Afghanistan. Guest houses are just places where Westerners live. Many of them are faith-based, many of them are not. But there was an attack on a place called the Roots of Peace on March 28th of 2014. And these attacks are called complex attacks because there's walls and security. And what the attackers do is they pull up with a car bomb, stop right in front of the wall, detonate the car bomb, which takes down the wall and gets them from the outer perimeter inside the yard. And then they go into the guest house with grenades, IEDs, and automatic weapons. So on March 28th, they mounted this attack. There are two guest houses sitting right next to each other. And it appears that the car was put a little bit more in front of the house on the left instead of the house on the right. But they blow up the car, the wall goes down, you have all the chaos following a car bomb explosion, and you have the attackers go in, and they go into the wrong house. So they go into the house that was owned, operated by a South African group called Roots of Peace. And they weren't a faith-based group, and they were armed, and they fought back. So there's this gun battle going on. At the same time, our friend Mujahideen talks to AP again and says he doesn't know that they're in the wrong place. But he says the attack is going on. He claims it for the Taliban because the guest house was actually a church used to convert Muslims to Christianity. He was wrong. It was a daycare center for missionaries who were in Afghanistan to convert people to Christianity. It was full of kids. That was their target. They knew it. They missed, went into the wrong house. But the Taliban is absolutely clear on their targets. A few months later, in November, there was an attack on a guest house owned and operated by this South African ministry, which is basically a family. Husband, wife, and two teenage children. The same type of attack, they went in. The wife was not there. She's a physician. She was actually working at the hospital, but the father and the two teenage kids were there. And in addition to just, yes, sir? Is this also in Kabul? Yes, sorry, it's in Kabul, yes. So they attack it. It was a fairly long attack. It went into the night, but they killed the two teenagers and the South African missionary. And again, our friend, this was a secret missionary group. Actually, it wasn't that secret. He was pretty well known as being an evangelist, but the Taliban's making it very, very clear why they're going after these targets. They're missionaries. They're Christians. They're here to convert people to Christianity. They can't be any clearer than that. So what does the present threat look like? It lacks the sophistication, at least internationally, of Osama bin Laden's 9/11 al-Qaeda group. That group is, again, it's suppressed, it's diffused and dispersed into hundreds of cells around the world that operate fairly independently. They call themselves like-minded, a term they've stolen from us in the Christian faith. There is a tremendous, here it says increasing, but I can probably change it now, it's been long enough. There is tremendous competition between these major groups and then the smaller groups that align with one or another. Remember, they're competing for sponsor money, usually state sponsor money. They're competing for recruits, and they're competing for time on television. After the Paris attacks, there were two attacks that didn't get as much publicity on resort hotels in two West African nations. And these were hotels that were frequented by Westerners, by missionaries and others. I told you I'd been at the Westgate Mall, and I'd also have been in both of these hotels that were attacked, so I don't know what that means. But that was an effort by AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, to basically say to the world, hey, remember us. We were here first. You know, we're not ISIS, but we can still mount operations. Now, the scale of the operations, quite a bit different. The fact that ISIS is willing to go internationally and into Paris and mount an attack there says far more about their capability than AQIM, which is about one country away. All they can do is, it's a relatively low-level attack on a hotel, but they need to keep the competition up. Softer high-publicity targets, recognizing the value of self-radicalized individuals, and then here's a big one. It was an article of faith that if a terrorist group failed in an attack, we, the good guys, reap the victory from that, because terrorism is all about fear. Do you remember, it's maybe a year ago now, there was a convention in Garland, Texas, of cartoonists with cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad. What could go wrong with that? But anyway, and there are two, I call them bad guys, and people say that's judgmental, so I'll call them adversaries. Two adversaries in New Mexico who decide they're going to go defend the Prophet Muhammad. So they get in their car, they dress all up in black, they get their stuff, and they drive up to Garland, pull right up in front, and get out of the car with their weapons and are going to attack this event. Fortunately, law enforcement realized that this was a high-profile target and something would probably happen, had a lot of security deployed. They got off a couple of shots, hit one security guard in the foot before a police officer, single police officer, out on the outer perimeter was able to shoot and kill both of them. That was a failed attack, yet ISIS claimed it. And they claimed it because, even though it failed, it caused fear. If they can do that anywhere in the country and nobody knew about it, where are we protected? Where are we vulnerable? Are we recording this? Can you just turn it off for just a second? See, if you have a question, ask Chuck. Thank you. And the president, yes, sir.
Going back to the present threat.
Yep.
The State Department just released an updated report saying that Iran continues to be the number one funder of terrorist operations, and that's what generated all just about $200 million in aid. How does Iran play in this whole scenario?
Iran has always been a state sponsor, well, in the modern time, has been a state sponsor of terror. They've been very good at it. They're subtle. They typically work through third parties. It's hard to trace it back to them. I have a hard time believing that Iran actually provides more money than Saudi Arabia does. But obviously, the U.S. government has to approach those two countries very, very differently when they talk about it. But I think as the top state sponsors funding of terrorism, it's clearly Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they're both very good at knowing how to mask that and protect the identity of those involved. Yeah, good question. Yes. No. No, the minute you said, can I explain why the government? Sorry, go ahead. You got to take the cheap laugh sometimes. Go ahead. Why did we? No, I can't explain it. Why did the U.S. government trade 5 high-value Gitmo prisoners for a military deserter? I can tell you that the pressure on the U.S. government when an American citizen is being held in a foreign country, whether by a terrorist group or by Iran with these trumped-up charges, the pressure on the government is tremendous. I've been in there, I've seen it, and it's incredibly how strong that pressure can be. I think one of the other things with Iran, whether we agree with it or not, the current administration has adopted a policy towards Iran being a nuclear threat, and that payment of money is consistent with that policy. So they're saying that we owe this money from way back, and so giving them that money is, I think, consistent with the administration's view, the current administration's view on Iran as a nuclear weapon state. Yeah, I mean, that's the best I can do. Some things are hard to explain. That's why it's a really good question. All right, and ISIS is clearly the dominant group in the world right now. It's driving everybody's agenda. ISIS is theologically and philosophically distinct from Al-Qaeda, but it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq that was the core of what has become ISIS. Some comments, Mr. Baghdadi, if you can kill a disbelieving American or European, especially the spiteful and filthy French, or an Australian, Canadian, or any other, then rely upon Allah, kill him in any manner or way it may be. Don't ask for anyone's advice. Don't seek anyone's verdict. Kill the disbeliever, whether he's civilian or military, for they have the same ruling. They're both disbelievers. He is characterizing it, again, just as bin Laden did, as a religious threat, a religious war. And he goes beyond anything bin Laden ever did and begins encouraging people to do whatever you can. If you can come to Syria and Iraq and fight with us, that's great. If you can't, fight wherever you are. Build a bomb. If you can't build a bomb, get a gun. If you can't get a gun, use a knife. If you can't use a knife, use a vehicle. There's an entire section in some of ISIS's training materials that talks about how to harden a truck to be used in an attack like we just saw driving down the kind of the boardwalk in France. And that's been proposed by ISIS as being a way to attack for a considerable period of time. But the key thing is here, it's religious, it's religious, it's religious. Yes, sir? The French, there's two reasons. The French have been involved in anti-Islamic, they've been a partner with the U.S. from the very beginning. So that's one reason. They're close, that's another reason. But France, I forget now how many years ago, came out and banned, anybody know what they banned in public? Burqas, head coverings. And that enraged the Islamic groups. And I think more than anything else, at its core, that's why France has become such a target. This is what ISIS said about the Garland attack. After they claimed responsibility, we say to the defenders of the cross, the U.S., that future attacks are going to be harsher and worse. The Islamic State soldiers will inflict harm on you with the grace of God. The future just around the corner. How many of you think that defenders of the cross is a great term to describe the United States of America today? We're not heading that direction, right? I hope I'm not just breaking that to you. But by characterizing us in a religious context, if you travel internationally, especially out of the first world, into any of the developing countries in the world, you will find that once people find out you're an American, they immediately believe you're a Christian as well. It just goes hand in hand. And he's just playing on that. But he has to keep characterizing the conflict as religious. I told you I wasn't smart enough to figure out if Islam was a religion of peace or violence. But I do know that there's two types in Islam. There are two types of jihad, holy war. The first type is, for lack of a better term, an offensive jihad. And there is authorization in the faith for jihad, holy war, terrorism to be used to advance the cause of Islam if it has been sanctioned and endorsed by clerics. If there's a fatwa, a credible fatwa, directing that. Participation of an individual Muslim in that type of jihad is optional. Okay. There's a defensive jihad. There's jihad, holy war, to protect Islam against threats to the religion. And that one, nobody gets a pass. The religion calls on everybody and mandates every Muslim to be part of defending the religion. And that is, of course, the type of war, the type of jihad that bin Laden and all the others have described, trying to pull as many Muslims into the fight as they can. Okay, this is where you don't have handout material, but we'll email it to you because this is brand new. Dabiq is the magazine of ISIS. ISIS is incredibly skilled at using the media and being sharp with it, whether it's video or the magazine. The 15th edition of Dabiq, Break the Cross. I'm not talking about the army, I'm not talking about the president, they're not talking about Congress, they're talking about the cross, they're talking about us. In one of the forwards in the magazine, this is the quote: between the release of this issue of Dabiq and the next slaughter to be executed again, blah, 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 who ordered the attack without delay. The Crusaders can read into why Muslims hate and fight them, why pagan Christians should break their crosses, why liberalist secularists could return to the fitrah, and why skeptical atheists should recognize their creator and submit to him. It's saying, we're coming to get you. There's some stuff in the magazine that if you read it and you adopt it and you agree to it, which is obviously professing faith in Islam, then you may be spared. That's the tone of the magazine. And then it has an article. The lead article is titled, Why We Hate You. And it gives 6 reasons. The first one: we hate you first and foremost because you're disbelievers. You reject the oneness of Allah, whether you realize it or not. By making partners for him in worship, you blaspheme against him, claiming that he has a son, you fabricate lies against his prophets and messengers, and you indulge in all manner of devilish practices. Number 2, we hate you because your secular liberal societies permit the very things that Allah has prohibited, while banning many of the things he's permitted. A matter that doesn't concern you because you separate between religion and state, thereby granting super blah, blah, blah. A lot of words. If you read the magazine, these are very wordy people. If you read any fatwa that's initiated, they're long, hard to read. Here's the key. We hate you because, in the case of the atheist fringe, we hate you and wage war against you because you disbelieve in the existence of your Lord and Creator, and they're not talking about God and Jesus. We hate you for your crimes against Islam and wage war against you to punish you for your transgressions against our religion. We hate you for your crimes against Muslims. It's as clear a statement of motive and intent in this magazine as there can be. And I think that when we have an adversary that's making it this clear what they want to do and who they want to attack, and we're having trouble as a society finding a name to give to that adversary. We argue about whether or not we can include religion into the name. We've got to do better than that. We've got to make more progress than that. I don't believe, absolutely do not believe, that all Muslims are violent, all Muslims are terrorists, all Muslims are jihadis. That's ridiculous. The vast majority are not. But the more this argument can be propagated, and the more that any Western nation can be maneuvered into doing things that look like it's attacking innocent Muslims, the better chance these kind of leaders are going to have to rally the people to the cause they want. You do have this slide, and this is pretty interesting. This is our government doesn't get it. Western governments don't get it. July 17th, Secretary Kerry in a CNN interview, ISIL in Syria and Iraq is under, and we argue over whether it's ISIL or ISIS. What difference does it make? Anyway, ISIL in Syria and Iraq is under great pressure. They're not growing in their ability to do things. They're shrinking. They're on the run. I believe what we're seeing are the desperate actions of an entity that sees the noose around its neck. Yeah, so the director of the CIA, just a month before, testifies to Congress. Unfortunately, despite all our progress against ISIL on the battlefield and financial realm, our efforts have not reduced the group's terrorism capability and global reach. In fact, as the pressure mounts on ISIL, we judge it will intensify its global terror campaign to maintain its dominance of global terrorism agenda. And it has to. It has to. Whoop, this is the one we need sound for? Sound help?
Tonight, for the first time, we're seeing a map from the
Can you just
Obama
pause it for a second?
administration and obtained by NBC.
So this is an NBC News broadcast from the 2nd, so just early this week, and this is new, and it's talking about somehow they got their hands on the briefing material the National Counterterrorism Center used to brief the president this week on the status of ISIS. So we'll go ahead and play it now. And just
Now to some exclusive reporting from our NBC News investigative team about the expansion of ISIS around the world. Tonight, for the first time, we're seeing a map from the Obama administration and obtained by NBC News that paints a detailed portrait of the terror group's global reach. Our senior investigative correspondent...
That's me. I am sorry. I can't be trusted with this stuff.
Now to some exclusive reporting from our NBC News investigative team about the expansion of ISIS around the world. Tonight, for the first time, we're seeing a map from the Obama administration and obtained by NBC News that paints a detailed portrait of the terror group's global reach. Our senior investigative correspondent, Cynthia McFadden, has details.
Today, the U.S. launched more airstrikes against ISIS targets in Libya, representing an expansion of U.S. military operations beyond Iraq and Syria. Also today, an NBC News exclusive, this map, part of the monthly classified briefing received by the White House, dated August 2016, from the National Counterterrorism Center. It shows the worldwide expansion of the Islamic State. A stunning threefold increase since the U.S. and its allies began their military campaign against ISIS 2 years ago.
That map could probably be a lot bigger if they were to show all the aspirational regions where ISIS wants to operate.
In 2014, there were 7 countries in which ISIS was operating. By 2015, that number was nearly doubled to 13. Today's briefing map indicates 18 countries where the Islamic State is fully operational. And a new category, aspiring ISIS branches, of which there are 6 countries, including Bangladesh, where last month ISIS took credit for killing 24 people. In a year in which politicians are vigorously debating the war against terror, the battleground is clearly expanding. Cynthia McFadden, NBC News, New York.
This is this week, and to have the government saying at one point the ISIS is on the run, and to be being briefed by the National Counterterrorism Center the same period of time that ISIS has tripled its influence or its stature, its number of countries and operating bases around the world, you just can't reconcile those. Now, it is true that in the places where there are military targets, things we can go bomb, blow up, attack through military forces, we're winning, and we will. I mean, there's nobody in the world that can stand up to the American military on the battlefield. But ISIS is smarter than that, and they will adjust and adapt, and so far they've shown they're faster than we are at adjusting and adapting. So what are we going to see? I think we're going to see an intense pressure in certain parts of the world for Islamic caliphates, whether they're ISIS or Al-Qaeda or some unique group, but a caliphate, an Islamic Sharia law dominated government that's intent on pursuing jihad. Iraq, Syria, who knows what's going to happen there. Yemen is absolutely a failed state. Somalia is a failed state. I've been in both recently. In fact, I was in Africa I think it was 18 months ago, and we were in a restaurant, we were watching the news, and the president was talking about his counterterrorism strategy, and he was pointing to Libya and Somalia, Yemen and Somalia as examples of how the West is winning. And I just looked at that and said, by what possible benchmark? And this is not a bashing of one party or the other. I think, frankly, experts would tell you that the way the war in Iraq was prosecuted by the U.S., not whether it was right or wrong to go into war, separate discussion, but the way it was prosecuted, removing every person who had ever been affiliated with the Ba'ath Party out of their jobs when you had to be in the Ba'ath Party to have a job in the government. Some of those decisions left created the environment in which Al-Qaeda and Iraq was born and morphed into ISIS. Anyway, more attacks on U.S. and European soil. Every informed intelligence chief, every informed head of state talks about this threat, that we're going to see more. A word that was never part of our lexicon in the U.S. counterterrorism strategy, it's always been a part of Israel's, but it's popping up more and more for us, is resilience. Resilience, which means the ability to absorb terrorist attacks. It's an indication of the appreciation that this is going to continue, and we're not going to be able to completely eliminate it. There's going to be another spectacular attack, and by that, probably in the U.S. You've all heard the numbers. You know, we have to be right 100% of the time. They have to get lucky once, and those are hard odds to defeat, especially if we want to keep. Especially if the United States, let me back up. Especially if the citizens of this country. Let me back up again. To prevent that from happening, how many of you spent some time in Israel or flown on El Al? Friendly airline, isn't it? Real friendly customer service, but the safest airline in the world. And it's the safest airline in the world because it doesn't take chances. There's any doubt, there's no doubt. There's any doubt, there's no doubt. That's a quote from an El Al security chief at a terrorism conference a while back. And the government of Israel has adopted incredibly stringent security measures. And the citizens of Israel have traded some of their civil liberties and civil rights off for that security, just as British citizens have. You can't walk around in London and not be on TV. I don't think the American public is ready to tolerate that. I don't think the American public is ready to give up the freedoms it would need to give up to prevent a spectacular attack. And again, not a question whether right or wrong, it's part of the challenge of trying to defend against this kind of terrorism in a free society. And that tension is going to be exploited by the adversary, and it'll be part of our environment for the next foreseeable future. Increasing attacks on random soft targets. That's especially where our interests come in. Increasing attacks on Christian soft targets. They're talking about it, they're talking about us, and they're doing it. And then the inspired attacker, the lone wolf. Lone wolf's not a great term. It's got images that it's the inspired, self-radicalized attacker. The one who, again, as I said before, if he can just keep his mouth shut, it's going to be almost impossible to detect. Yes, sir. Was everyone able to hear what he said? Okay. He said, I'm the best speaker he's heard all morning. He said, okay, this stuff is good, but why isn't it being preached to and through to the American public through 60 Minutes in the media? There are a couple of reasons for that. I don't want to be on 60 Minutes. I'm still go out and do hostage negotiations. I have to worry about my own profile. I used to, back in the 90s, I did the talking head thing for a while. Now there's so many talking heads out there that, anyway. There has to be an interest on the part of the media. I'll tell you, let me give you an example. There was a comedy show on NBC that did 6 minutes. Do you remember the name, Lynn? What it was? It was two characters from Saturday Night Live. I don't even remember their names. Anyway, it was an hour situation, or it was an hour comedy of skits and things. And in their first episode, one of the skits they did showed a hostage and his kidnapper, and they were making a proof-of-life video. And the skit was the hostage was a filmmaker, and he keeps telling the guy making the video, "Oh, you're not doing well enough. You got to beat me up more. I got to be bleeding. It's got to be much more violent." And you know, I've had to show those videos to spouses, and I've seen a lot of videos, and to me that was as inflammatory as making fun of a rape victim on television. And I wrote to the head of NBC Entertainment a fairly polite letter, and put in some of my credentials so they knew that, you know, I wasn't just a guy in the street, and just really protested and said, you know, I'd be happy to meet with you and show you real ones, but I think you guys really dropped the ball, and you need to pull the skit and apologize. Let's see, what did I hear back from NBC? Not even an acknowledgement of the letter. And I called and talked to a guy in his office and confirmed they got it. Louder? Yeah, Maya Rudolph and Marge Short. Yep, that was the, yeah. It was Maya and Marty, or Marty and Maya or something. It only did 6 episodes, but I don't know. I'll give you maybe an example of that in just a minute. Let me get through a couple more slides, and I'm going to come back to that because it really is a good point. So what does it mean for us? For missionaries, the term missionaries is being thrown out, but there's no term to replace it yet. Maybe workers, Western Christian expatriates, whoever they are targeted specifically by these terrorist groups around the world, and they're having to take much more stringent precautions. And if your church is supporting missionaries overseas and you have them in any areas where they're at risk of this, you need to be asking questions about their safety and security. If nothing has changed in the past 10 years about safety and security, they are behind the curve. Overseas ministries are a target. Many of us belong to churches that are heavily involved in missions overseas. And if you are, that's a potential target. But then right here in the U.S., the church is the most visible, symbolic, available, soft-appearing target for all the things that ISIS and these other groups have said they're against. Right? I mean, we are. We're on the front lines. There's no way to reconcile our ultimate, one of our ultimate purposes as a church, which is to share the gospel of Jesus Christ everywhere in the world. Here, there, everywhere. There's no way to reconcile that with the goals and worldviews of an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda. It's an inevitable clash, and that's not going to change. There's not going to be a merging of these two faiths, that's for sure. And one side is using violence to attack the other side. And, as church leaders, pastors, and any church leader, yes, the term sheepdog, I like that term. A shepherd, the sheepdog is, it sounds cooler than shepherd. I get it. But the primary job of a shepherd is to protect the flock. That's always the primary job of the shepherd, is to protect the flock. And I think that's one of the reasons why in Scripture the term shepherd is used so much to describe who we are. That's not our entire job, but our job is to protect the flock. And we can't do that if we don't understand the danger. We can't do that if we don't acknowledge the risk. We should not be afraid of it. We should not fear the danger. We shouldn't fear the risk. But we need to be wise about it. We need to understand it. And we need to do the things that we can do to manage or mitigate that risk as best as possible. When I talk to mission groups and missionaries, I don't like to use the term security. Security's got this image of identify risk and keep whoever you're responsible for away from the risk. But that doesn't work for us, because the Great Commission says go to all the nations, go to all the people groups, go everywhere and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. We don't get a pass anywhere because it's dangerous. I think the term we should replace it with is stewardship. Stewardship. I think God calls us to be the best stewards of every resource He's given to us. And the only irreplaceable asset He's given the church to fulfill its mandate, the Great Commission, are people's lives. Everything else is replaceable. So I think we need to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves as we go about being shepherds and protecting the flock against this threat. There are some things that we can do, but it's amazing to me, this is still an issue today. The 9/11 Commission's report said that perhaps the most important failure was one of imagination. We do not believe leaders understood the gravity of the threat. I was responsible for security management at the Urbana Student Missions Conference in St. Louis back in December. It happens between Christmas and January. And there was an incident involving what could have been a bomb placed in the stadium. And there was a distinct difference of opinion on how to handle that. Our security team wanted it handled. We wanted people cleared out, which we did. We wanted a bomb dog to come and sniff it before we made a decision. The shift supervisor for security for the Edward Jones Dome, where the Rams used to play before they come back to LA, came on and said, no, we see these things all the time. We're just going to pull it out. We're not going to disrupt anything. It was actually a laptop computer in a very thin canvas bag. And he says, you can't put bombs in laptop computers. Oh, okay. He said, we do hundreds of these a year. His plan was luck. It probably won't be us because it's never been us again, and we have to have better insight than that. Whether you're at a church, whether you're doing missions, some basic things. Risk assessment, understanding the risk, understanding, some churches have, let's say a church, this church, and I'm not picking on this church, and I have no idea if you do it or not, but invited Franklin Graham to come and speak. You'd get a big crowd. Franklin Graham draws a lot of name recognition, a lot of publicity, and he's a lightning rod name in this conflict today. Just as Bill Bright was in the 60s talking about communism in the Soviet Union. And we don't think of Bill Bright as being, that kind of a lightning rod, but they were. We want to do risk assessment. We want to be honest about what the risk is to our flock. Do what we can to manage profile. If Franklin Graham was going to come here, I would, as soon as it's sold out, I'd stop publicizing it. Simple things that we can do to reduce the profile. Target hardening, yeah, you're going to put security out, right? Maybe do some things, depending on your risk assessment, to protect against a car bomb. Probably going to think about adding additional security. Maybe think about magnetometers, I don't know. There are lots of options out there for target hardening. And then learning to do counter-surveillance. Counter-surveillance is easy. People who do surveillance are watching us where we are most frequently, where we're at most frequency. Home, work, going in between. We're the subject matter experts. For someone to do surveillance against you and get information, or do surveillance against a place like this church, they have to come in and try to get information and not be detected. If you're on the ushering or greeting staff of this church, or you're on the security team of this church, I bet you've been told what people look like when they're up to no good. We don't say profiling because that's such a nasty word, but we do profile. We profile behavior. We look at people's behavior. And we're the experts. We know what someone who's not sure about coming to church, it's kind of like in the pool, you stick your foot in, and we know what those people look like. And when we talk to them, we know how they react. And if somebody reacts a different way, then maybe it raises our suspicions. Easter Sunday, a evangelical church in Turkey, in Ankara, it's a fairly large church. There was a guy, the churches had all been threatened with an attack on Easter, and there's a guy up in the kind of the lobby area, and he's taking pictures of every poster that the church had that identified people's names or talked about Sunday school classes and things like that. Okay, behavior, it's pretty easy to see. But learning how to do counter-surveillance, these are all things that you can do. With that, I've run out my time. I'm going to do a couple of questions, and we may save some others for this afternoon. Go ahead, sir. Yes.
That was 1993.
Yes.
When his laptop blew.
Yes. And it wasn't just a plan. This was a plan, a work in progress that was disrupted because someone started a fire in their kitchen, basically, because some of these guys are knuckleheads. They don't hide their motives from us. They don't hide their intents from us. Again, the Bible's got the admonition we need. Be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. Be wise as serpents. With that, Chuck, are we going to go to break, or I'll turn it over to Chuck? And I'll see you this afternoon.